Hi folks, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. So on this channel, I've looked at a few papers that talk about different ways of prompting large language models or LLMs, things like few-shot prompting, chain of thought prompting, program-aided prompts, and so on. This paper I'm looking at today is great because it tries to construct a catalog of all these various prompting techniques. And of course, prompting is really important because that's the central way by which you get an LLM to do tasks. So let's look at some of the prompts in this catalog. I'm not going to cover all of them, but just a few, but I'd strongly recommend reading the whole paper if you're at all into LLMs or prompting. This table shows their high-level categorization of prompting techniques and then the patterns that fall into each category. And the way they describe each one is, of course, with a name and a classification, the intent of the prompt, the motivation, why you want to structure prompts that way, how exactly the prompt is structured with some examples, and then some trade-offs or pros and cons of trying to phrase your task as a prompt with that pattern. If you've seen the Gang of Four Design Patterns book for software engineering, this kind of tries to follow the same pattern but for prompt. So let's start by looking at the meta language creation pattern, and this comes in really handy when you're trying to map a specialized domain in which your task is situated to what an LLM can understand or manipulate. So, for example, if you want to solve a problem related to graphs, you might start your prompt by explaining some basic terminology for how you are using notation to denote the edges and nodes in a graph and the weights on the edges. And once you set up this preamble, you can then frame your tasks in terms of that graph notation. Another very interesting pattern is the flipped interaction pattern because, as the name suggests, it makes it so that the LLM is driving the conversation by asking you questions as opposed to the other way around. And this usually takes the form of, I would like you to ask me questions to achieve some end goal. So here's a concrete example. You frame your prompt to say, I would like you to ask me questions to deploy a Python application. And this then makes the LLM ask questions. When you have enough information, create a Python script. So that kind of flips the interaction pattern. Now, one really interesting category is the prompt improvement category, which is very meta. You're using the LLM itself to suggest to you better prompts or better ways of phrasing prompts to accomplish a task. One example of that is the question refinement pattern, where you're asking the LLM to suggest better questions or better prompts for the task that you want to accomplish. Here's a concrete example of that, where you tell the LLM to suggest better versions of your prompts specific to a domain, in this case, security risks, for example. So this can really help you to fine-tune your prompts and get better answers from the LLM. There's also been a fair amount of coverage and documentation of how LLMs will often hallucinate facts, and there's an entire class of prompting patterns that can try to help with that. One of them is the fact check pattern, where when you ask an LLM for an answer, you also ask it to enumerate the facts that need to be fact-checked. And those you can then go independently check. And there are a ton of other very useful prompting patterns in this paper, so please go take a look. I hope you found that useful, and I will see you next time. Thank you very much.